In the winter of 1944, a German test pilot climbed into a cockpit that no sane man should have entered. The aircraft beneath him had already killed. Its engines were unpredictable, its airframe untested at combat speeds, and the engineers who built it weren't entirely sure it would come back down in one piece. But the Reich was desperate. And desperation in wartime Germany had a way of overruling common sense. What happened next didn't just kill a man. It helped kill a program, and with it, one of the most dangerous gambles Adolf Hitler ever placed on a single piece of technology. By 1943, Germany knew the war in the air was changing. The Allies were deepening their bomber campaigns over the Reich. 8th Air Force B-17s were hitting industrial targets in daylight. The Luftwaffe's conventional piston fighters were struggling to intercept them at altitude before the American escorts arrived. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was furious. Hitler was demanding results, and the RLM, the Reichsluftfahrtranstiste, Germany's aviation ministry, was throwing resources at anything that looked like a solution. But its path to the front was being strangled by political interference, fuel shortages, and Hitler's catastrophic insistence on converting it into a bomber rather than deploying it as the interceptor it was designed to be. So while the Me-262 languished in bureaucratic purgatory, other programs moved in the shadows. One program in particular represented everything that made late-war German aviation simultaneously astonishing and doomed. Is one that most aviation histories gloss over far too quickly. While Messerschmitt was still refining turbojet theory, funding it largely out of his own company's resources, his chief engine designer, Hans von Ohain, had demonstrated a working centrifugal flow turbojet, the Hayes III, as early as 1939, and on August 27th of that year, the Heinkel He 178 made the world's first flight of a turbojet-powered aircraft. Heinkel expected this to shake the foundations of German aviation policy. Instead, the RLM gave him a polite nod and continued prioritizing conventional programs. Heinkel was not deterred. He pushed forward into something more ambitious, a twin-engine jet fighter with a tricycle undercarriage, its pressurized cockpit and ejection seat. The ejection seat alone placed it years ahead of anything the Allies were flying. This was the He 280, and on paper, it looked like the weapon that could hand Germany air superiority well into 1945. The aircraft was designed under the leadership of Heinrich Hertel, Heinkel's chief of technical development. The airframe was sleek, the twin-engine configuration promising exceptional thrust, and the planned armament of three 20mm MG 151 cannons gave it genuine hitting power against Allied bombers. The first prototype, the He 280 V1, was completed in late 1940 and initially tested as a glider, towed aloft to examine aerodynamic behavior before the engines were ready. The first powered flight came on April 2, 1941, at Henkel's facility in Rostock-Marienne on the Baltic coast. Test pilot Fritz Schaefer handled the controls. By all accounts, the aircraft flew. It climbed, it maneuvered, and it returned in one piece. Schaefer reported promising handling characteristics. For a brief moment, Heinkel had reason for optimism. But the problems were already there, lurking beneath the surface like cracks in stressed metal. The Hayes 8 engines powering the He 280 were centrifugal flow turbojets in earlier design. Philosophy that produced reliable operation but limited thrust compared to axial flow alternatives. They were also temperamental. Cold starts were problematic. At altitude, throttle response was sluggish in ways that would matter enormously in a real dogfight. Every kilogram of drag at those speeds cost something. It cost the margin of performance that separated a fighter from a target. Development of improved engine variants, the Hayes 8A, continued, but each iteration brought new complications. Heinkel's engineers were working at the bleeding edge of what metallurgy and manufacturing could sustain. It could tear the aircraft apart. Meanwhile, the RLM was watching both Heinkel and Messerschmitt. Comparative evaluations were conducted, and here the politics grew poisonous. Albert Speer's armaments ministry was pushing for production simplification. The Messerschmitt Me 262, despite its own developmental delays. The Me 262 airframe was also considered more structurally straightforward to mass produce. The He 280 was brilliant. But brilliance in 1943 Germany needed to come with an efficient production pathway, and Heinkel couldn't promise one fast enough. The critical demonstration came in early 1943. A fly-off was organized to compare the He 280 directly against the Focke-Wulf FW-190, one of the Luftwaffe's finest conventional fighters. The results were not the advertisement Heinkel needed. The He 280 showed speed advantages, and then the weather intervened in a way that would define the program's fate. On January 13, 1943, test pilot Helmut Schenk was airborne in an He 280 prototype when the aircraft's controls began icing over in severe winter conditions. The aircraft became unresponsive. What happened next secured one small but significant place in aviation history. Schenk activated the aircraft's compressor ejection seat and successfully escaped. The loss of a prototype was damaging. The He 280 in operational conditions, cold, ice, high altitude, was not the robust interceptor the Luftwaffe needed. Its engines iced. And behind every technical setback, Heinkel faced an adversary as dangerous as any Allied engineer: the German bureaucracy. Though his death was officially characterized as an accident for propaganda purposes. Milk distrusted Heinkel, partly due to long-standing corporate and personal rivalries. Every report that came across his desk finding fault with the He 280 was filed with something approaching satisfaction. By March 1943, the RLM made its decision. The He 280 program was canceled. The aircraft that carried an ejection seat and a pressurized cockpit before anyone else had managed either was abandoned. 9 prototypes had been built. None would ever fire their guns in combat. The decision was not obviously wrong, viewed from a purely technical standpoint. An operational jet interceptor might have been in Luftwaffe. Before the Allied strategic bombing campaign had reached its full, devastating momentum. What the He 280's cancellation also did was concentrate everything on the Me 262, and then Hitler intervened. When the Me? The answer was technically yes, though doing so would degrade its performance catastrophically. Gring, unwilling to contradict the Führer, agreed. The Me 262 spent months of its operational life being modified for a role it was poorly suited to, while Allied bombers continued dismantling German industry with diminishing opposition. By the time Hitler's Blitzbomber directive was eventually reversed in late 1944, it was too late for the jet program to turn the air war around. Fuel was critically short. Pilot training had collapsed. The infrastructure to support large-scale jet operations barely existed. The Me 262 units that did form Jagdwehr Band 44 among them, filled with some of Germany's most decorated aces, achieved remarkable individual results. But they were a fraction of what might have been. In the end, the Allied reaction to German jet technology was a mixture of alarm and calculated response. British and American intelligence had been tracking Heinkel's and Messerschmitt's programs since captured documents and agent reports began surfacing in 1943. The RAF accelerated development of the Gloucester Meteor, which entered service in 1944. An American P-80 Shooting Star development was pushed with new urgency. Allied bomber crews were briefed on evasion tactics against jet fighters. Never try to outrun them in a straight line. Exploit the jet's fuel consumption and turning limitations, stay in tight defensive formations. The threat was real, and the Allies knew it. After the war ended in May 1945, Allied technical teams swept into German airfields and facilities. The surviving He 280 prototypes, or what remained of them, were examined, documented, and largely scrapped. German jet engineers were divided between the Americans and Soviets under various exploitation programs. Hans von Ohain, the man whose engine had first powered a jet aircraft into history. ended up working for the United States Air Force. He spent decades at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base contributing to American aviation research. He and Frank Whittle, the British jet pioneer, eventually met, compared notes, and reportedly found each other deeply respectful. Ernst Heinkel survived the war, rebuilt his company in the post-war period, and continued working in aviation until his death in 1958. He never entirely stopped arguing that his He-280 had been robbed of its chance by politics and personal vendettas rather than technical failure. Looking at the evidence, it is difficult to entirely dismiss that argument. The test flights that revealed the He-280's limitations didn't kill the program in isolation. What killed it was a system, a chain of bureaucratic competition, personal rivalry, resource misallocation, and ultimately a dictator who understood propaganda better than aerodynamics. The aircraft itself, in a healthier environment, might have been something extraordinary. Instead, it became a footnote. The first jet fighter to fly. The first aircraft from which a pilot ejected in an emergency, and a machine that never once engaged an enemy in combat. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in wartime isn't the enemy across the lines. It's the machinery of your own side deciding what matters and what doesn't. The He-280 mattered. Germany just couldn't afford to believe that soon enough.